So with that, I will make a start. I acknowledge that we meet today on the beautiful lands traditionally owned by the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation as traditional owners and custodians, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I want to acknowledge that these communities continue to embrace their continued connection to this land. And I want to acknowledge elders from other communities who are with us today, and all First Nations people who work both here at Weehai and across the precinct. I also want to welcome the Indigenous students who are here from the University of Melbourne, and a Wominjeka and a big hello to the staff at Bundoora and Kew, who I believe are on the live stream. Welcome everyone to the Institute's inaugural International Women's Day address. Today is a day of great celebration. I'd like to extend a really warm welcome to Professor Marcia Langton, who will be delivering the inaugural address this afternoon, and we're absolutely thrilled and privileged to have you here with us today, Marcia. Today is a special day of recognition and of celebration of women's social, economic, cultural and political achievements. But it's also a call to action for accelerating gender equality. This can only be achieved by collective action and shared ownership by individuals and organisations who care about human rights. The 2019 International Women's Day campaign theme is Better the Balance, Better the World. Balance is not a women's issue, but it's a community and it's a business issue. Gender balance is essential for economies and communities to thrive. The Institute is proud to have made a decade-long commitment to achieving better gender balance in our workplace, and in late 2018, the Institute was one of only 15 higher education and research institutions nationally to receive a SAGE Athena Swan Award in recognition of our work on gender equity. And I want to acknowledge all of the hard work from our staff and students that went into that process. Our flagship Gender Equity Award programs have provided critical assistance to women to balance their work and caring responsibilities, and this financial support equates to over $3 million in investment in our women in science. One of the Institute's proudest moments, and a bit of a tearjerker, was the opening of the Professor Lynn Corcoran Early Learning Centre in June last year. The centre is the first of its kind at an independent medical research institute in Australia. While we have seen a significant improvement in the number of women in senior scientific positions at the Institute over the last decade, we know there's still much more work to do. Our 4-year Gender Action Plan provides a roadmap to gender equality, and we've established a new Gender Equality Committee to lead this work in 2019, led by James Vince and Joanna Groom. A vital part of this activity is to ensure all women are enabled to achieve their potential. Our Gender Action Plan has a strong focus on addressing additional barriers women from minority groups face, including those from culturally diverse backgrounds, lesbian, bi, trans and queer women, and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women. And we want to do everything we can to support these women and the next generation to succeed. So with that, I am delighted now to introduce Professor Marcia Langton to deliver the 2019 International Women's Day address on the status of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women in Australia. Professor Langton AM is an anthropologist and geographer. However, as you will see today, her sharp intellect and wide interests mean that her knowledge is quite cross-disciplinary. Since 2000, she's held the Foundation Chair of Australian Indigenous Studies at the University of Melbourne. Her role in the Empowered Communities Project, under contract to the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, and as a member of the expert panel on constitutional recognition of Indigenous Australians, are evidence of her academic reputation, policy commitment and impact, and alongside her role as a prominent public intellectual. Professor Langton is a Fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences in Australia, a Fellow of Trinity, and an Honorary Fellow of Emmanuel College at the University of Queensland. And in 2016, she was honoured as a University of Melbourne Redmond Barry Distinguished Professor, which is quite a high honour. In further recognition as one of Australia's most respected Indigenous academics, Professor Langton was appointed as the first Associate Provost at the University of Melbourne in 2017. And on a personal note, Marcia has been a very supportive mentor to me and definitely inspired me as a young Indigenous woman from regional Victoria to pursue a life in academia. And this platform has enabled my opportunity to contribute to Indigenous affairs, education, health and research at a national scale. So thank you. Marcia continues to inspire and support young Indigenous scholars to contribute to the national conversation. It gives me great pride and pleasure to invite Marcia to the podium for what I am sure will be an absolute treat. Thanks, Marcia.
thank you. That was very generous and kind. My little hero there. I acknowledge the Wurundjeri traditional owners and pay my respects to their elders past and present, and thank you for this invitation to speak to you on International Women's Day 2019 on the subject of the status of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women. I do not have good news for you. I want to draw your attention to two aspects of our status and explain what I think you should know in order to work with us to reach equity and parity for Indigenous women in Australia. I believe we in the university sector have a role to play in bringing our scholarship, research and analysis to the attention of Australians, particularly government and non-government agencies, to address these matters. These two issues that are critical to understanding, in my view, why Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander men and women as a population fall behind other Australians on most indicators are violence and incarceration rates. And yet these issues receive little or no attention in the Closing the Gap reports and the parliaments of Australia. Obviously, these issues are interrelated. The high rates of violence against Indigenous women and children and the accelerating rates of incarceration of Indigenous women are directly related. I ask you to listen carefully to the Indigenous people who are striving for better outcomes in the treatment of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander men and women in our legal and police systems. Over the last half-century, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander men and women have drawn attention to the family violence and other forms of violence such as inter-clan disputes in Indigenous communities and established programs in an attempt to ensure the safety of women and children. Indigenous women dominate in the history of advocacy and campaigning for policy reforms to address the need for safe communities. Yet, until recently, their work has gone almost unnoticed. But our voices are being heard, and the matters we raise are becoming the subject of serious consideration in some quarters at least. The Australian Institute of Health and Welfare reports that family violence is worse for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. It occurs at higher rates than for non-Indigenous Australians, and it needs to be understood as both a cause and effect of social disadvantage and intergenerational trauma. And of course, as you already know, I believe incarceration rates as well. In 2014-15, and the figures are on the screen, 1 in 7 Indigenous women experienced physical violence in the previous year. Of these, about 1 in 4 reported that their most recent incident was perpetrated by a cohabiting partner. And can I point out that these statistics are problematic because of the extreme underreporting, which I'll tell you about later. From 2013, 12 to 13 and 13 to 14, 2 in 5 Indigenous homicide victims were killed by a current or previous partner, or that represents twice the rate of non-Indigenous victims. In 14 to 15, Indigenous women were 32 times as likely to be hospitalised due to family violence as non-Indigenous women, while Indigenous men were 23 times as likely to be hospitalised as non-Indigenous men. In 2015-16, Indigenous children were 7 times as likely to be the subject of substantiated child abuse or neglect as non-Indigenous children. In Queensland, where I come from, 1/3 of the women in prisons are Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women. The Australian Law Reform Commission tells us that Our women are frequent victims of crime, particularly interpersonal or violent crime. Female prisoners from our mob are likely to have been victims of crime themselves, particularly family violence and sexual abuse. Prison population surveys have revealed high rates of family violence and sexual abuse among incarcerated Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women. One Western Australian study suggested that up to 90% of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander female prisoners were survivors of family and other violence. A New South Wales study in 2014 revealed that 70% of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander female prisoners disclosed they were survivors of child sexual abuse, with 44% subject to ongoing sexual abuse as adults and 78% experiencing violence as adults. The National Association of Community Legal Centres submitted similar data on the rates of sexual abuse and assault of Aboriginal women in prison in New South Wales. A study of Victorian female prisoners found 87% were victims of sexual, physical or emotional abuse, with most having suffered abuse in multiple forms. It distresses me that the catch-all term disadvantage masks the racism of our legal systems and police forces and their witless drive to continue incarcerating our people at higher and higher rates. The Australian Law Reform Commission has put the relationship between violence and incarceration of women bluntly and plainly. In 2001, the New South Wales Aboriginal Justice Advisory Council reported that at least 80% of Aboriginal women surveyed linked previous experiences of abuse indirectly to their offending, with histories of sexual abuse in particular noted as central features of women's pathways into offending, their experiences of custody and their capacity to engage in rehabilitation programs. And then on the issue of how to address these incarceration rates, the Law Reform Commission notes that the high rates of substance abuse and psychological distress must be addressed, and particularly the prevalence of family and sexual violence must be a priority and involve targeted trauma-informed responses, including culturally competent supports and interventions. So there are campaigns like the Human Rights Law Centre and the Change the Record Coalition. But I have to say that their recommendations really so far haven't been all that strong or helpful. I am distressed that the relationship of violence rates to these imprisonment rates is ignored universally by governments and by many in the Indigenous sector. Why are these issues so difficult to discuss outside of our academic and research environments? Only in 2017 has the leadership of Indigenous women been recognised, with the appointment of June Oscar AO to the role of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Social Justice Commissioner in the Human Rights Commission. In the 25 years of this special role in the Human Rights and Equal Opportunity Commission, she is the first woman. So her appointment gives me cause for optimism. I am encouraged, but also frustrated that it has taken so long for the Indigenous world to finally adopt a pro-woman approach to the annual celebration of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander life in this nation. It's also encouraging for the thousands of women whose voices have rarely been heard, even while they bear the brunt of the disadvantage that are measured in the annual Closing the Gap Misery Fest. But is mere representation of women on committees sufficient in the context of rising rates of violence, incarceration of women, and removal of children from their families? The policy light approach to these issues across Australia raises the potential of more failures or such slow progress on, for instance, reducing child mortality rates to cause a collapse of Indigenous confidence in governments and their role in Indigenous affairs. June has raised these issues of violence and incarceration of our women in her role as Social Justice Commissioner. Can I just point out that this is the latest report. This came out last month. This is the WA Coroner's report on the suicides of 13 children and young persons in the Kimberley region. I'll just leave that there for a moment. So June said in her Grace Vaughan lecture last year that while Indigenous Australians make up about 2 to 3% of the general population, 28% of the Australian prison population are Indigenous. And it is Indigenous women who account for most of the growth in that population. There has been a 77% increase of women in prison. Indigenous women are 34% of the women behind bars. June also highlighted the fact that in 2017, Western Australia had the highest jailing rates of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the country, and 22.3% of its Aboriginal prison population were women. She calls it a systems failure. When there is a systems failure, as there currently is with our incarceration system, First Australians always suffer a disproportionate impact, and the most vulnerable to this failure, the latest victims, are our women. I agree with her. Our government's judiciary and police are failing us, failing Australians, and I believe contributing to the accelerating rates of child removal from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander families. For women, it's their gender that makes them the target of violence. Most of the domestic violence victims in Australia are women, and most of the perpetrators are men. The other main category of victims is children. The violence knows no bounds in some communities, and there is a tragedy befalling Indigenous children whose own incarceration rates rival the Indigenous adult imprisonment rates, and whose trauma is the subject of a growing number of inquiries, such as this one. Recently, I joined with other Indigenous researchers to bring to international attention these very serious human rights abuses in Australia in relation to removal of our children from our families in a letter to The Lancet, which will be published soon, I hope. Along with Marlene Longbottom, Hannah McGlade and Kathleen Clapham, we address the impact of new adoption legislation in New South Wales. The Parliament of New South Wales passed legislation late last year, imposing an arbitrary 24 months for children in out-of-home care to be reunited with their families before adoption can become permanent. So you can see the very real risk of Indigenous children leaving their families forever. Guardianship orders under this Act can be arranged without parental consent, and amendments to the application process of family restoration and removal of parental consent for adoption can only take place on permanent orders. So this 2018 Children and Young Persons Care and Protection Amendment Act conflicts with the principles of family restoration and healing for Indigenous people, and it constitutes a breach of human rights law. So nationally, Indigenous children are 10 times more likely to come in contact with the child protection system and are in care longer than non-Indigenous Australian children. This is a serious human rights issue, and as I said, inconsistent with Australia's obligations to international human rights laws. We urged the New South Wales and federal government to respond immediately, and we recommended that Indigenous Children's Commissioners are appointed across all jurisdictions at the state and federal level. This pattern of traumatisation of Indigenous children was reported in 2006 by 3 mental health workers in the Kimberley, Ralph Hamaguchi and Cox. They presented a paper at a Canadian conference and revealed that sexual abuse of children was contributing to high suicide rates and warned of dire consequences. So you can see, many years later, ignoring their warnings has resulted in a terrible tragedy. As I said, the highest rates of suicide in the world, and most of them are children. Not most, sorry, many of them are children. So the numbers now are climbing, and my guess is that about 20% of the victims are children. So intergenerational trauma has contributed to a state of fear and helplessness, and worse, an acceptance of violence as the norm. These are the issues that they raised back then, and Indigenous women continue to raise these issues. More and more young girls are being sexualised and abused at a young age, dooming them to lives of trauma and further jeopardising the future of the family as a viable social institution. But one of the worst outcomes of this normalisation and acceptance of violence is the laissez-faire responses of the criminal justice system to these victims. And so our chances of changing these terrible outcomes lessen as the system becomes less and less responsive. So the WA coroner made 42 recommendations in the cases of the suicides of these 13 children, and she's recommended Kimberley-wide limits on the sale of alcohol and more to be done about the practice of illegal sales of alcohol or sly grogging, and the WA government, as of this week, has declined to do that. She's also argued for the creation of a Commissioner for Aboriginal Children and Young People. We've heard nothing from the WA government on the other recommendations. Well, that recommendation for a Children's Commission and the other recommendations. So this report is a window on the conditions of extreme poverty in the Aboriginal communities of the Kimberley. In these settings, the impacts of violence and trauma have led to the highest suicide rates in the world. The victims are primarily Indigenous, and as I said, many are Indigenous children. There are some policy improvements, and they may lead to better outcomes, but we must be vigilant in assessing the outcomes. With my colleague, Dr. Kristen Smith, who's sitting in the front row here, and two wonderful Aboriginal women working with us here, and Aboriginal women in the Kimberley, and some other local people up there, we are investigating the patterns of family violence with the support of a generous grant from ANROS. Our project, Improving Family Violence Legal and Support Services for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women who are victims and men who are perpetrators of family violence, will map the services available and the gaps and barriers to effective service delivery for victims and perpetrators in their journey through the legal and criminal justice systems and service delivery environments. Several reforms were announced at a 2016 Council of Australian Governments meeting: a National Domestic Violence Order Scheme, a National Information Sharing System, and the development of National Perpetrator Standards. Reporting on these developments with transparent and accessible data is urgently required. This is essential if victims are to have integrated and effective support during regular crises, the episodes of violence and community mayhem from which they may need safe haven. The police need to be trained, for obvious reasons, to treat the victims and household members with respect and to quickly remove the perpetrators of violence. They need to make the process of a victim obtaining a restraining order or domestic violence order streamlined, and they need to follow up to make sure that the victims do not surrender to their fears. Their lives and the lives of children involved are always at risk, as the statistics show. They need the removal of the offender, not the women and children, easy access to social security payments and bank accounts. legislation to ensure police protection of victims from perpetrators and their enablers. A national task force of highly qualified Indigenous women and men should be appointed to identify the programs and policies that work and that are most urgent. We who are familiar with the patterns of violence in the Aboriginal world know that one of the key problems is the code of silence. Women are too afraid to call the police or to seek assistance, too afraid to apply for a restraining order because the police will not attend in any case, and if they do, they will involve child protection authorities and remove the children to institutional care. Or, as is increasingly the case, they will arrest the female victim. The women's prisons in Perth are filling up with Aboriginal women who were arrested when they called the police to obtain assistance in a domestic violence crisis. Early government attempts to break the silence on domestic violence in Australia were largely driven into action by global and national feminist movements, with some consequent changes to policy and legislation informed by the experience of women's refuges during the 1980s. Domestic violence, a feminist concept that encapsulates the unequal sexual dynamic of power experienced by women at the hands of their male partners, was also a key feature of discussion and debate in early Aboriginal feminist writing. Far from silent on the issue, Aboriginal women scholars and activists from the 1990s onwards, well, actually it's from the 1970s onwards, contributed their knowledge to the increasingly publicised crisis of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander violence that they themselves observed in the context of their own urban, regional and remote communities. A theme that emerges in their work is a unique focus on the intersections between colonisation and gender inequality that is often suppressed, discredited or simply ignored in current academic literature and policy on the subject. For Aboriginal writers, family violence is a term that is used to describe a matrix of violent and coercive practices. Examples which include economic, psychological, physical and sexual that occur in communities, and the preference for this term is located in the traditional meaning and practices around the central importance of family and kinship, involving a range of reciprocal ties of obligation and mutual support. For this reason, intervention strategies and responses must recognise that men, women and children are interconnected through a system of kinship and mutual obligations, and remain so even after violence has occurred. So there are shifts in the nature of this violence and the way that it occurs from region to region in the light of local history, circumstances and concerns. But what all these communities have in common to varying degrees amongst themselves and also with other Australians is intimate partner violence. There are some differences such as jealous fights, and humbugging for food and money, clan and family feuds, and the opprobrium attached to neglect of familial obligation. So in this context, it becomes clear that domestic or intimate partner violence is but one aspect of a larger problem in our communities. It seems obvious that judicial officers and police forces of Australia need to lift their game and deal more effectively with the scourge of family violence in the Indigenous world. We should unanimously clamour for more support for the victims. Too often they are ignored in the fashionable rush to perpetrator behavioural change programs. The data shows the situation worsening in every conceivable way. Why doesn't the rule of law, so highly valued by all major political parties and purported to be one of the bedrocks of Australian society, work to stop this? Well, one of the reasons is, can be read in the third National Action Plan, where it's claimed that some Aboriginal leaders informed the government that these levels of violence and abuse are cultural, whatever that means. When I ask what they might mean by that, they have no answers. What do the Aboriginal leaders mean when they give this deadly advice? And I mean deadly in the dictionary meaning. They are referring to a new version of Aboriginal culture that can only mean, if we follow their arguments to their logical end, that assault, forced detention, capital and corporal punishment and sexual assault of adults and children are permissible. These actions are illegal under Australian law, but are condoned by some men in the Aboriginal world as a form of Aboriginal culture. The argument, the logic and the consequences are repugnant and should be regarded as such in Australian policies and laws. Another excuse for the violence, the dominant one I think, is that Aboriginal men are the victims of colonisation and need to heal before we can deal with the violence. For raising these issues, as I've done for at least 40 years, I've been accused of labelling all Aboriginal men as rapists and perpetrators of violence. I was accused of such by a highly educated, urban, cosmopolitan Aboriginal male academic at a meeting of Indigenous health workers and research leaders in Melbourne a few years ago, and by an Aboriginal male lawyer who was one of the leaders of the Change the Record campaign at a meeting of Indigenous health staff in Brisbane. This is the standard dismissal of Aboriginal women who advocate for solutions to the violence that are aimed at giving some respite to the victims. Again, the argument, the logic and the consequences are repugnant and should be dismissed. The logical answer is that men who do not approve of such violence should stand beside Aboriginal women advocates to end the violence and defend their cause. They should report perpetrators of assault and rape to the police. They should demand that the criminal justice system deal with these matters effectively. So why do they make these statements? Well, I believe that it is because they believe that men come first. And the result of these false arguments is the failure of victims to report assaults. We know that the barriers for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women to report assaults include the distrust of institutions, poor relationships with police, the lack of police presence and response, but also a lack of access to support services in any case, included, and they're determined by their remoteness often, and the lack of cultural competence of support service providers. This reluctance is often attributed to the framing of perpetrators as victims in Aboriginal communities because of the high rates of incarceration of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander men and deaths in custody. So you can imagine that a woman victim would think twice about reporting a man to the police, knowing that there is some likelihood, a great likelihood, that he might not come back alive. Women fear that if they report incidents, their children will be removed. And their apprehension, obviously, is reasonable, given the statistics, which range from 7 times to 10 times other Australian children being removed from their families into out-of-home care. Another issue in underreporting is the fear that perpetrators will go unpunished when reported due to mistrust and loss of confidence in the police, justice system and other government agencies. Well, just yesterday it was reported that in Queensland a judge allowed a non-custodial sentence for a man who severely abused his partner, slamming her head against a wall. So he's out today, and the Queensland judiciary have just had a wonderful holiday all together in the Greek islands. Given our current lack of knowledge regarding the true extent of this violence, Olsen and Lovett epidemiologists have called for more qualitative and quantitative studies to contribute to this area, and this is what Kristen and I and our team hope to do. We need to determine the extent of this violence accurately, or as best as we can. I think it's obvious to most researchers that there is no one causal factor that can explain this violence against Indigenous women, and that we can't know without research that tackles the underreporting by victims, the lack of screening by service providers, incomplete identification of gender and Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander status in many data sets, and the lack of nationally comparable data on family violence available from police, courts, health or welfare services. So, as I said, the conviction of offenders of family violence may be perceived as the victims, exacerbating the victimisation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander men by the state. And inevitably, this draws criticism and intimidation from other members of the community or local population. So the victims become even more isolated. Many women are calling for restorative justice measures as a means to tackling this complex of problems. But we don't know enough to answer the question, would restorative justice measures improve the situation? We need more research. The stresses for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander victims leading to post-traumatic stress disorder and other emotional and mental states will vary for women victims, depending on the rates of assault and hospitalisations and the capacity of institutions to respond, especially in the cases of extreme violence and homicide. There were, in the last 2 years, at least 2 cases of the homicides, or as I prefer to call it, femicide, of 2 Aboriginal women, one in New South Wales and one in Western Australia. And in both cases, the police and the state prosecutors failed to respond adequately, and the litany of very clear complaints about their failure to implement Australian law in the way that they would for other Australians really is, I think, it's shameful. I was heartened to read some of the direct statements from Aboriginal women in the Anne Rose report, Changing the Picture. This is what they said. We need to get more elder involvement in educating Aboriginal men and women that violence is not part of our culture. Another woman said, the drivers of change have to come from within the Aboriginal community. We need men and women saying that violence is not acceptable and it's not our culture, and that we need to have solutions in place. Yet another woman said, having strong messages in community about what behaviour constitutes violence can help to shift attitudes and reduce tolerance of violence. The more people are aware, the better chance there is of reducing the occurrence of violence in the community. And a frontline worker, probably the most experienced in New South Wales, Dixie Link Gordon, said, we need really straight up talks, courageous talks, where you say to your own brothers and sisters, cousins, whatever, that this is not acceptable. And you know, it doesn't mean that you love that relative any less, but you're telling them, you're being direct with them. We need to be able to be looking after each other, and violence within our homes is not acceptable. So, in their report, they've used the phrase, nothing about our mob without our mob. And they demanded a seat at the table and to be the architects of our own lives and our own destinies. And there are some very practical reasons for this demand. There's the issue of underreporting, as I've explained, and also that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women will seek help from a range of services if the personnel are Indigenous like themselves and more likely to understand their situation and respond without racism or condescension and provide a culturally safe environment and response. So I see this as the kind of circuit breaker that we need, because the existing services don't respond and don't respond adequately. And as this has been going on for the 40 years that I've been watching it, this is I think, the essential circuit breaker to get immediate responses and also preventative responses. So in the 2018 COAG Summit, National Summit on Reducing Violence Against Women and Their Children, held in Adelaide, several key Aboriginal advisors assisted in developing the statements that ensued. But there is an obvious tension between the widely but not unanimously agreed view that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander agency and self-determination is fundamental, and the need for reforms to laws, procedures and policies that govern the array of government agency responses and services. With the exception of a few Aboriginal-owned or operated corporations, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander policies address themselves to these government responsibilities in terms of practical policy reforms in only a number of respects. So we need more Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people capable in the policy development, participating in developing policy. And Anne Rose has assisted in that regard, but this is, as I say, listening to Indigenous women has only started in 2017. And there are several aspects of policy formulation that are of concern that involve a wide range of service responses and data sovereignty. In other words, Indigenous control of data, Indigenous reporting of data and Indigenous interpretation of data. So they say, the women say that they want our way for addressing family violence in our communities, a way that recognises the impact of intergenerational trauma on our people, our families and our communities, incorporated in policies. And they use the term healing as a way of talking about all of those responses for dealing with the trauma that is widely attributed as a primary causal factor in the incidence of family violence. It also involves the recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultural knowledge, kinship, skin group relationships, social strengths and resources, gender-specific roles and cultural obligations rules. So this need for a seat at the table is a very important one. It's interesting to see that the Police Commissioner in the Northern Territory, Rhys Kershaw, has responded to those demands in a very interesting way. And he's introduced in the Northern Territory Police Force at least some good measures, so I acknowledge his work. We need more collaboration across the range of services that make up the family violence, legal and support sector. We need greater use of digital technology and web-based services to track the progress of victims and perpetrators through the system and ensure improved safety for victims and families. There is a strong argument for a move from incident response methods to a comprehensive preventative approach. I urge against failing to respond to the needs of victims in favour of a long-term preventative approach, because many people become traumatised in this field, especially the frontline workers, not just the victims, and I think the argument for a comprehensive preventative approach is both an argument from governments to avoid their financial responsibilities, their fiscal responsibilities in this area, but also for the frontline workers, the overwhelming caseload that these services are confronted with, and their lack of capacity to respond to the immediate needs of victims and perpetrators. I don't think that we should ignore the victims. It's clear to me that we need to listen to the victims and, you know, perhaps the traumatising experience for all of us of listening to the evidence that's been emerging slowly from the Pell case and other cases of clergy abuse here in Australia and around the world might alert us to the very real issue of listening to victims and taking them seriously. I would have liked to have had time to acknowledge the many wonderful women who've been so brave in this area. So I'll just mention one name, Loacha O'Donoghue. She was the first chair of the now defunct Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Commission. She started life as a nurse in South Australia. She served in the armed forces, as many Aboriginal women did. And she was an inspirational woman in this area. Last year, the NAIDOC committee determined that the theme of our NAIDOC celebrations was "Because of Her, We Can." I agree that it's important to be positive in our outlook and to inspire hope in others. At the same time, it is necessary to be vigilant. I need to say this: a slogan is not a sufficient response to the seriousness of this situation. Our government's accurately measuring the violence against Indigenous women and children, their imprisonment, the removal of the children, and their worsening poverty? Or are they ignoring the signs of social collapse in many places? It is difficult sometimes not to be cynical about the costly spin that accompanies the politics. We are so very far from parity for Indigenous women and children, and the work ahead is challenging. But we must face those arguments from people who will never concede that we are their equal, and those who show great nervousness about allowing Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women to enter the corridors of power. I am encouraged by the precise, persuasive reporting of former Governor-General Quentin Bryce and her team in their report, Not Now, Not Ever, Putting an End to Domestic and Family Violence in Queensland. Likewise, the legal reform arguments of the 2017 Victorian Royal Commission into Family Violence, led by former Justice Marcia as Commissioner and Patricia Faulkner and Tony Nicholson as Deputy Commissioners. Their 227 recommendations embody world-leading reforms. And as I say, the sound recommendations of Northern Territory Police Commissioner Rhys Kershaw, whose officers responded to 75 cases of, sorry, that should read 75,000 cases. People never believe me. I put 75,000 into the text and people take the zeros out because they don't believe me. That's from Rhys Kershaw himself. 75,000 cases of domestic violence in the Northern Territory from 2014 to 2016. But as I say, a victim's voice should always be heard. A victim's voice should have priority. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we've got some. We're going to have a couple of roving mics come down the sides for a couple of quick questions. Thank you for such a powerful and sobering view. I think I think we've all learned a lot today. Questions from the audience. Fiona Stanley.
Thank you so much, Marcia. I'm cynical as well, but I'm trying not to be. But given that we now have such huge evidence that Aboriginal control of services is actually not just effective, but cost-effective, acceptable, and that people use them, and that, as you pointed out, that it also has impact on other outcomes that are unexpected, like, for example, self-esteem. I mean, this isn't rocket science, but we've known this for a long time now, and the juggernaut continues of the mainstream services that don't have an Aboriginal voice, and we're all supporting that voice if we can. Do you think that one of the reform agenda closing the gaps should be the extent to which there is Aboriginal control and Aboriginal, real Aboriginal control of service provision, particularly in this particular area?
Well, yes, I do. I don't think that this area got enough attention in the refreshing the Close the Gap process. The targets have been revised, and I have to say I'm pretty disappointed with the targets and indicators on violence and racism. The excuse used is that they're not measurable or they're not easily measurable. Well, I don't believe that's to be the case, and I think that's why we in the university sector have a role to play. Thank you for that question, very important question. Thank you.
And I think probably following on from that, I think the catalyst for us as medical researchers is then how we facilitate, with our employment strategies and health equity, talking about getting more Indigenous voices at the table. Well, we need that as well to break down the barriers of maybe you could comment on the institutional racism. I mean, you talked about some of the issues, Marcia, around the police, the judicial system and the racism in the police force and ways to overcome that. But it was also the particular cases that you pointed out, it was also at the hospital, when these victims were sort of in the police cell and taken into hospital. There was a terrible case that happened in Western Australia recently. So maybe if you could comment on that in terms of, and then what role we could play as health workers and researchers in that area and getting more Indigenous researchers and scientists and medical staff trained.
It happens so often, especially in Western Australia, and it's very hard to talk about, but I'll just give you a summary of the Mizzou case. She was a victim of violence, intimate partner violence. The police arrested her, and at the time of her arrest, she had broken ribs. She didn't know what the problem was, but the police threw her in a cell. She was crying and sobbing in pain. They took no notice of her and accused her of being a junkie and racially abused her for days. She was in fact dying from septicemia from the rib sticking into her lungs. And the police took her to the hospital and were, again, extremely abusive, laughing at her, humiliating her. And, you can tell from the evidence in the coronial case that the police and the hospital staff, all white of course, all racist of course, were having a great deal of fun abusing this woman and encouraging each other in their abuse. The nurses at the hospital refused to treat her. She was taken back to the cell. The story goes on and on. In any case, she died. The family demanded a coronial inquiry. They had to demand a coronial inquiry. Eventually, there was one. The coroner, unlike Fossley in the suicide cases, was, I think, negligent and irresponsible, and I'll say it, racist. And her findings were just an outrage. So there's no justice for that family. But, you can read the evidence. I wrote an article in the Monthly about that case, and also the case of Lynette Daly, who was murdered in New South Wales by 3 white men. The police actually did their job properly in that case and compiled the evidence. The New South Wales prosecutor refused to prosecute. A campaign was waged, and there was an excellent 4 Corners report on this case, and eventually 6 years later the prosecutor was forced to prosecute the men. They were pretty promptly found guilty by a jury and they're now incarcerated. But these two cases are not unusual. And so these, you know, if you read these cases, you can see why victims don't report and why we fear that the statistics I've showed you, as alarming as they are probably significantly under-enumerated.
Questions? Or Aaron is pointing over here somewhere. Oh, up the back.
Thanks, Misty. Thanks for your talk, Marcia. Can you tell us, as white folk, what's the best thing, I suppose, that we can try and do to assist, to understand, to do better?
Okay, well, this is a personal gripe, and I'm sure everybody's had an experience like this, but I've had so many of them. I'm going to call it the racism in the ARC assessor system. So we as academics really need to be better informed about these matters, because I can tell you that some of the assessor reports I've had on my applications, grant applications over the years, and particularly one last year on these problems, you know, well, they're just gobsmacking. They're gobsmacking in their stupidity and their racism. Academics have to lift their game too. You know, oh, hello, yes, I've got a PhD, yes, I'm a professor, yes, I've been in the university system for about 25 years, and I'm Aboriginal. I think some of the assessors think, despite the way I've written it, dropping big hints, they think I'm not Aboriginal, and I've actually been accused of colonialism. Tell me how that works. Okay, I'll call it, it's racism. I'm black, therefore I couldn't possibly have written it, or it's written so well, it couldn't have been written by a black. You see what I mean? So they catch me both ways. So that's why I'm very grateful for the opportunity to speak to you today, to tell you all of this, so that when you assess an ARC grant or an NHMRC grant about this matter, you will be better informed and you will think more carefully about your assessor's report. I've got to say, some of them are just stupidly vicious and spiteful, you know, just appalling. So that's one thing that we as academics should be aware of. And, you know, the failure to elevate young Indigenous people through the system, to give them opportunities, you know, to reach the proper parity targets of the university sector. Why are we so far away from a reasonable target of 3% of our university workforce being Indigenous? Whereas we're so far away from that target, we're still at less than 1%. You know, everyone's got a job to do in that area. Let's encourage Indigenous people through the system, make sure they get promoted. I can tell you one story. Of course, you know, many of my worst stories come from the Faculty of Arts. One professor actually took the application of a candidate out of the pigeonhole. This is in the old days when you put things in pigeonholes, and removed it so that the application was never seen, so that her student would have a competitive advantage. Isn't that spiteful? I've seen so many of these, you know, petty academic crimes throughout my life. I'm old enough, I don't care anymore, I'm calling it, you know. That's just some practical suggestions right there.
But I think it's a good reminder for us all, isn't it? And certainly at a place like WeHi, where we do review, a lot of us here do review, you know, Indigenous health grants, for example, and being aware that, you know, when there's, you know, the research project might be working in community, but there's no Aboriginal CI on the grant, or, you know, they haven't engaged with community and things like that. So these are all things we can be aware of, apart from then promoting and supporting our Aboriginal staff and students. Jace, have you got a quick one? Because we're right out of time.
I've got a very quick one.
Okay.
I think the points you're getting at are everything is seated in racism, a lot of these inequities, which I think I would definitely strongly agree with from what I've seen. Do you think in those closing the gap targets, we should be changing the direction of improvement to focus it back on non-Indigenous people and trying to close the gap of a lack of understanding and giving some responsibility to non-Indigenous people in Australia to get better?
Hallelujah. You know, we kept being told by people last year in this Refreshing the Close the Gap report that racism isn't measurable. Give me a break. You know, the United Nations measures racism. Everybody else in the world can measure racism, but apparently it's not measurable in Australia. So, yes, you're 100% right. All of the closing the gap, well, you know, the closing the gap paradigm, let me call it that, it's a bit of a lazy term to use, I know, somehow manages, you know, in the wash-up to put all of the onus on us and none on governments, none on government agencies. How does that work? You know, we live in, you know, a permanent 1984, you know? Yes, you're right.
So just before we finally thank Marcia, I'll just quickly remind everyone as well that we're taking part in the International Women's Day Better Balance campaign, and so you'll see posters in the tea room highlighting where better balance is needed in society, including politics, sport, boards and the home. So you can add your thoughts on where you think better balance is needed to improve the lives of everyone. So now we have a small gift for you, and it just remains for us all to thank Marcia for a very thought-provoking speech today. Thank you. It's a very small gift.